And we are incredibly lucky to be having a very intimate conversation with Padma Lakshmi today about her new show on Hulu called Taste the Nation. As many of you know, Padma is the executive producer and host of award-winning Top Chef, which last season just concluded last week, so this is a busy time. She's a best-selling author, a food expert, actress, model, mother, and indeed activist. Very much the columnist. But also, Padma is a long-time supporter of the James Beard Foundation, for which we're hugely grateful. She's been a supporter of our women's leadership programs, and then more recently, since the time of COVID, when the foundation has pivoted all of our activity and resource and programming to help independent restaurants get through this crisis and build back better, Padma has been with us step by step and has been very supportive of our overarching campaign called Open for Good, which you will see featured through her show. So we are so grateful for that. We'll also be joined later on in this call by two of the show's participants to hear about their experience. But first of all, Padma, congratulations. This is such a fresh new look at the evolution of America's food culture. And you're giving voice and spotlight to communities and chefs and cuisines that don't typically get mainstream coverage. And your show illustrates just how much American foodways and some of the most iconic foods have been shaped so profoundly by immigration, by immigrants, as well as by indigenous and enslaved people. And to quote the New York Times' review, Taste the Nation, with 10 episodes that collectively expand and redefine the meaning of American food. It really is quite extraordinary. I have devoured the show. It is so edifying and educational. The human stories are so compelling, and it's visually stunning too. So we'd love just to hear from you before we bring in the other participants. In terms of what was the genesis of the show, Padma? What was it that motivated you to do this in terms of your own immigrant story, but also your role as an activist?
You know, I would have never said that I was a very political person. I mean, I was a surrogate for Clinton, and I did campaign for Obama, but that was sort of all it was, you know. And then after the election, after the Muslim ban and the separation of families at the southern border, I couldn't stay silent. So I really was hit very deeply by this issue as a mother, to be separated from these toddlers, but also as an immigrant. And so I started working with the ACLU, and the American Civil Liberties Union sprung into action right away. And I participated, you know, with Tom Hanks and Tina Fey, who were doing this telethon on Facebook, and everybody did it. There were a lot of us who did it, and you know, that's how I first got involved with them. And then I just started doing little speeches for them, or I went to rallies, or, you know, we had our first town hall for them, just to tell people their rights, you know, how to protest legally and safely, which we could use all a primer on now, I think. And anyway, you know, so during these speeches and things, I would often self-refer to my immigrant story, because that's what my viewpoint was framed and formed by. And after a while, I just got sick of talking about myself, frankly. And, you know, I was very in deep with a couple of the attorneys there on immigration issues, because I wanted to learn about the ins and outs of it in as much as I could as a layperson, so that I spoke properly about it. And in finding out so many horror stories about this issue, and also what was going on in these detention camps, you know, that they often don't get an interpreter, that they're asked to sign, all of this stuff, and we don't have time to go into here, I was kind of horrified. And there was so much rhetoric coming out of Washington for political gain, negative rhetoric about immigrants and, you know, what they did or have done to this country and what they will do if we let more of them in. And that just didn't square with my experience growing up in immigrant communities. I mean, I'm an Indian immigrant. I came here when I was 4. But, you know, I went to school with a ton of Mexican Americans, Filipino Americans, Jamaicans, all kinds of people. And my experience of immigrant life in this country was completely different from what we were hearing about. And so I suppose this is my rebuttal. You know, I wanted to do something positive and something that allowed me to prove my point, but with other people's stories. And I wanted to hear those stories from them. So often we hear about these foods or these cultures or these people's lives from other ambassadors or so-called ambassadors, other people who don't know them well or who think they know them well, you know. And I wanted just to give them a microphone and say, it's your turn, take this platform, because I was curious. I love food and I love discovering different ethnic foods all over the world. And our country is really diverse and very delicious. And there's so much that we have to offer in this country. And a lot of that is because of the waves and generations of immigrants from all over the world. I don't think that's something to be feared. I think that's something to be encouraged. I don't think that's something to threaten us. I think it should give us comfort that there always is this, you know, renewable source of talent, discipline, hard work, extra labor force, all of those things.
Yeah.
And so that's how it really came about. It, you know, it was me wanting to say something that I felt needed to be said.
Thank you. And you cover and you feature such a broad sweep of the nation, from the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina all the way through to the Thai immigrants in Vegas. I'd love for you to share with our audience, how did you go about, I imagine, the hard job of selecting which communities to give the mic to give voice to, and then within that, which individual contributors to feature?
It was hard. I mean, we had a much longer list, you know, probably of like 15, 20 names. My producing partner and I came up with one with our showrunner. Sort of, we each had our list and then we combined them, and then we went to Hulu, and they obviously had, you know, a lot of opinions about that too. We had 10 episodes and we had to do what we needed to do within those 10 episodes. I complicated the matter because I didn't want to just do immigrant communities. I thought it was very important that African American food history in this country got its own episode, because we've only heard about it in relation to its connection, you know, related to the white colonial masters, frankly, you know. But enslaved enslaved Africans came to this country hundreds of years ago with a whole body of knowledge, with hundreds of years of culinary African heritage. They were sought after for their agricultural knowledge, for their experience with cultivating rice and knowing how to harvest it. It is no accident that the Carolina rice industry floundered after emancipation. And I wanted to look at that. I wanted to give them the same treatment that I would give Thai Americans or German Americans or Indian Americans. And it was the least I could do. And I think that's really hit a nerve with people, obviously. But I also wanted to do an episode on Native American food, because if I was going to look at what American food is, I have to say what it was in its purest form before it was contaminated by any Western European, colonist or settler, or, pick whatever name you want to use for that group of people. But I wanted to look at what was here originally. Who were the original Americans and what did they eat? And even that, I picked one group in Arizona, and I went to the San Carlos reservation, and it was fascinating to get to know these Apache people. But you could do a whole season just on different Native American communities in this country, because obviously, somebody who's a Shinnecock Native American from the Northeast is going to be much different than somebody who's an Apache in the Southwest. We did as much as we could in the first season.
Yeah, it was some amazing spots, including a number of James Beard Award winners, and not so much the kind of the best chefs, but some of our America's classics, which are those quintessential local neighborhood restaurants that are the stalwarts of the community, and many of which are run and owned by the immigrant community. So it was great for us to see that spotlight too. And you talk about that episode in South Carolina, and seeing Michael Twitty again, the Cooking Gene, James Beard Award-winning book. It's great that this show has provided elevation for those very important voices. And as you were going through the 10 episodes, and this was all filmed last summer and last fall, and the world has changed, and we'll talk a bit about that later when we bring on our two other guests. But looking back on that, what were some of the most what were the aha moments for you in terms of, oh, that's an insight or a learning I hadn't anticipated, and I'm thinking about the world differently as a result of this exchange? I think we may have lost Padma. Would this be a good time to play the video?
This is my first rodent.
What does it taste like to you?
Tastes like chicken. Everything that the American cuisine is today is because all these different people and different cultures contributed to it. Oh my God. It's such a flavor explosion. This is my first rodent.
Everybody knows Thai food. Nobody knows about Thai people. There's the dish, and then there's the hands that prepare and serve the dish.
Everything that the American cuisine is today is because all these different people and different cultures contributed to it. This alone is reason to come to El Paso.
That's good, huh?
Burp a little. Let's Thai 2.0, dude.
Had my time?
Watch your back.
God damn it.
Food is medicine. We've all heard that before.
It's much deeper than just what feeds you.
It's like a spiritual connection.
The gateway to another culture often happens first through food. Okay, inshallah.
If you sit at my table and eat with me, you'll know who I am.
This is what American food looks like. This is the original. This is real America. I'm really sorry you can't eat this. I always do that. Oh, there you are. I'm muted. Can you hear me, Claire?
I can hear you. I can hear you. This is always the delightful challenge of these things. Is the
I know. I'm sorry I lost you guys.
we have let's bring on Naz and Brandon too. But that's such a great trailer. But for the members of our audience, and this is our food lovers, our members, our community, all 10 episodes are now available on Hulu. And as I said, I was so compelled, I just went from one to the next, so you don't have to wait week by week. I strongly encourage you to go and consume and watch it. Okay, wonderful, great.
Everybody's on. Good.
Everybody's on. It's a miracle. We're all here. Okay.
Can you hear me?
You can, yes. And you have these wonderful peonies as a halo, which is a nice floral aura. So we're delighted to see. I'd like to now introduce our two other members of the panel who feature in Padma's show Taste the Nation. So Naz Deravian, writer and actor, food blogger, and author of award-winning book, Bottom of the Pit, Persian Recipes and Stories, which was also a James Beard nominee. So really wonderful to see you, Naz. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for persevering with the tech.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We're also joined by Brandon Jiu, Michelin star chef and owner of 3 restaurants in San Francisco, including Mr. Jiu in the historic Chinatown in San Francisco that's featured in Taste the Nation, and also semi-finalist of the James Beard Foundation's Best Chef Award just a few years ago. So Brandon, wonderful to connect with you too. So just broadly, we'd love to hear from Naz and from Brandon in terms of what was your experience being on the show, working with Padma, and what was it like for you to have this unique platform and indeed microphone to tell your story? Naz, why don't we start with you?
It was a joy. to begin with, to go shopping with Padma. I think, you know, the very first time I met her was at Tehran Market, which is my favorite Iranian market here in Los Angeles. And right away, you know, we hit it off, tasting all the food in there, opening all the packages. But more importantly, being able to share this part of my culture. You know, I did that in the book, but having this avenue of sharing it with Padma on her show, it's really been a gift, I think, to our cuisine and to our culture.
Wonderful. And Brandon, will you share with us what your experience was as being part of this wonderful creative collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, Padma's really easy to talk to. I mean, that's the thing about when you talk about food or you talk about culture, like it's talking to a peer. She's really easy to engage conversations that go much deeper than just, hey, what's your favorite, you know, food or something like that. That, you know, she gets really into some of these deeper stories that kind of take a couple of more questions to get a little deeper of an answer. And I think that's what I experienced with her is she really dug to get some of the things that were important to be told.
Using food as the gateway to all the deep history and anthropology and politics. And Padma, share with us a bit of that process in terms of the research and the line of inquiry.
Sure. Once we knew the different communities we wanted to feature, we honed in on who we wanted to talk to, and you know, beyond each episode being a different city, a different immigrant enclave, it was also a different hero dish. You know, we wanted one dish that may or may not have been what that community authentically eats now, but it's, you know, we chose the dish for different reasons. In the case of the Chinese episode, we chose chop suey because it was always, to me, this mythical unicorn that I had heard about, but could never really taste or see or understand. And so, you know, obviously I know that my Chinese friends in New York or LA aren't eating chop suey, but I really wanted that to be the gateway, just a conversation starter. And, you know, then we started our research, and because the show was shot in a very intense schedule to, you know, accommodate my Top Chef schedule also, we had to shoot all summer long. And so we had 3 production teams. One was doing pre-production and doing sort of the legwork of the research and bringing it to me. And then I would tell them to go out and do some more or go this way rather than this way. One production team was in situ, on location with me filming. And then the third production team was doing post-production. You know, we have a list of information we need to get out to our viewers in the episode. If we don't get it in an interview, a lot of that is also the history and the research, the backstory. Then, you know, we look at how to do that in voiceover. I'm not a big fan of heavy voiceover. I think it's always better to show than tell, if that's possible. But on the other hand, I am a history nerd and I am a food nerd. And so there's just so much that's only possible in 30 minutes. And I really wanted for people to have the context and the history of these foods, because they're a wonderful Trojan horse, so to speak, to get into the history of these communities. You know, you can trace a community's history just by the foods they eat. You know, if you look at Spanish food, if you look at some other countries' food, you can really tell the migration patterns, what was brought from where, by whom. And that stuff is my jam. Like, that is what I'm interested in. And so I took a gamble that there would be a section of the TV viewing public that would also find that interesting, that wasn't being served by the programming that is currently on air. And so that's how we would start. In the case of Naz, I knew right away that I wanted to talk to her because Food 52 had me judge their Piglet Prize. Right. And so I felt like I had Naz, because other than her mother, I probably read it, more thoroughly than anybody. I remember the essay where she talks about walking down the hall in her apartment building in Westwood, and she can smell the rice, and how her child is biracial. And then I had cooked through her book because I had to judge it. So I literally cooked through half of her book, and I'd have done more if they weren't breathing down my neck for this essay. And so I knew I wanted to go and see Naz. I have had Persian friends growing up. I know the cuisine, obviously not as well as Naz, but I love it. And I was always attracted to the culture. Persian culture is so deep and so vast, and not just food-wise, but literature and movies and music. The music is beautiful. The poetry is insane. I had friends who were Baha'i. And so this was a culture that I really, really had an affinity for. In the case of Chinatown or Chinese Americans in San Francisco, I live down the street here from Nolita, from Chinatown in New York. And I wanted to go somewhere else. It was purposeful. We wanted to go and see where the original Chinatown was, because it gave us a chance to talk about the history of Chinese in America and Chinese Americans. And it was very important to me to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which happened in 1882 and did not get repealed until the 60s. And so, that allowed me to draw parallels across the series with the Japanese and how they were first, invited to come here. And then when we were done, needing them or whatever, all of a sudden we turned on them because of Pearl Harbor and things like that. And so there are parallels in American history as far as what's been done to many different immigrant groups. And it allowed me to talk about, the Chinese Exclusion Act and all that propaganda. There was so much stuff that we unearthed that was horrible. All these posters. I mean, you see a few of them in the episode, but then you see it again with the Japanese, and you're seeing it today with the family separation. The family separation detention camps are not much different than the Japanese internment camps and in World War II, and nobody talks about this. And it is my belief that if we're enjoying these foods, we better understand where they come from and the history they carry. Because if we don't, it's not that we can't enjoy them because they're ugly histories. There's enough ugly history to go around for everybody. But perhaps if we're willing to look at this history, then we can evolve above it, understanding that we keep making these mistakes repeatedly. And, the show is not designed for people who think like me. And as much as I've gotten to know Brandon and Naz, for people who think like them, it is designed for people who are in red states, who vote Republican, who vote or lobby against immigration. There was an aha moment for me, as Oprah would say, when there was all this legislation and stuff being talked about in Congress to address the child separation issue, about 3 years ago. And Ted Cruz voted like Ted Cruz is going to vote. And then there was this image of him in a Mexican restaurant enjoying, his tacos or enchiladas or whatever. I just found that hugely hypocritical. So I'm hoping that this is a positive way to get some of those conservatives to look at this issue on a human level. What is life like for these immigrants day to day? What is the policy that's handed down from Washington, D.C. Do to the people who are living in this border town, who have relatives who are across the border in Juarez, who walk from Juarez for 36 years every day to work that hot grill at H&H Car Wash, another, James Beard recipient. So, this is what I wanted to look at, and I was happy to have really articulate, forthright, magical thinkers like Naz and Brandon. I mean, Brandon was perfect because he was, a very, very successful, very, very high caliber chef. And he, grew up as an American in the same way that I did. And, like me, did probably a lot of code switching, when we went through this threshold of our mother's houses and the threshold of school, what was that like? And so I wanted to prove my point with their stories, not just mine.
Right, right. And you're right. I mean, it is so critical having an appreciation of the broader dimensions of what brings food to the plate, what is the politics behind it, what are the stories behind it, who are the people behind it. And actually some of those things can feel a bit overwhelming, but food is such an accessible on-ramp that we all have. So that's why I think this multi-dimensional storytelling that's enshrined within the show is so important. And so you were talking about the iconic dishes, which are the gateway to the culture. So Naz, I mean, first of all, I love that scene in the Tehran market. It was so tantalizing with all those exquisite ingredients. And I love the slightly clandestine Victoria's Secrets bag full of the saffron stash. That was a lovely juxtaposition.
Doesn't everyone hide their saffron in a Victoria's Secret bag?
I know I do now.
And one of the dishes, which is what I think your renowned book is based on, is tahdig, in terms of that exquisite layering of rice and scented and saffron and turmeric and dill. But it looks bloody hard to execute. And I know that there are a lot of people who on this call who are deep food lovers who are all very interested in experimenting with new food cultures. And I think Persian, as you said, Padma, it's such a luscious and fragrant and compelling cuisine. Not to get trivial, but any top tips that you would give if you, because it's such a center stage of the Persian dinner. They're wanting to embrace that. What would you recommend?
Try again. Never give up on tahdig. Yes, I mean, in a nutshell, if you're starting off, get a non-stick pot, basmati rice, the two-step, first you want to boil the rice al dente and then strain it and then steam it. But really, there's no science to it, which is what Padma and I talked about as well, and which is something that I've had to embrace. There's no science to it. There are these steps, but then you just have to, like anything else, like any other dish, you just have to keep trying it, and then you get a feel for it, because it all depends on the pot you're using, the heat element that you're using. Like I like to joke, but I'm not really joking. The time of day, the mood I'm in, if I'm in a rush, my tahdig's gonna suck. It's not gonna be a very good tahdig. If all else fails, a Persian rice cooker. An Iranian rice cooker will become your best friend, and it's specifically made for making tahdig. And your friends will love you, and you'll flip that thing, and everyone will lose their minds, and they'll throw a party for you, and you'll be the hit of the neighborhood. So get an Iranian.
This is new information for me too. I spent like 16 hours with Naz. I never knew there was a specific rice cooker. I mean, we all have rice cookers or pressure cookers or whatever, but there's a specific one to tahdig.
There is. It's in my book. But we like to give this stuff out in bits and pieces, because all you people, you might need time to consume it all. Take it all in.
Well, that's one we will, and so both the investment and the theater of the flip is part of the overall experience. Okay.
One thing, having said all that, the tahdig is wonderful, and it's, and like you mentioned, there's great theatrics to it, but it's really about that rice itself. It's about serving that rice, and you want it to be, each grain needs to shine on its own. That's what we really treasure and value. Yes, the tahdig, it's great, but it's how that rice itself turns out when you serve it. So for instance, if my mother was hosting like a party, or if she was entertaining, she wouldn't necessarily flip the thing. She would serve the rice, and it would be scattered across that platter, like jewels scattered across the platter, and then the tahdig would be served on the side. So I know that we love to talk about tahdig, but it's really about the rice itself and how you turn that rice out.
Indeed. Thank you. And Padma, you talked about this just now. There was a common theme running through the series, which was about the dynamic nature of acceptance. It's not a linear line. The longer you're in the country, the more accepted you are, and it ebbs and flows depending on the kind of geopolitics, the relationship between America and one's country of origin. And I'm just thinking about China and Iran, and thinking just since the show was shot, how those dynamics have changed. And so, Brandon, would you just share with our audiences any reflections you had in terms of what you've experienced through this time of COVID from that kind of cultural acceptance perspective?
Yeah, when we filmed the show, this, the way that the president has referred to the virus, that wasn't even out there yet, so this has really intensified the fight in Chinatown, especially, knowing that we have to come together and persevere again. I mean, and this is a neighborhood that's persevered through a lot already, and there's a lot of hope and I think strength there, but it's also it's disappointing to the elders that this is happening again, but like, I think for me, the position that I'm in now, just hearing Padma talk earlier about, there's these political events that happen that affect you, and you start to become a spokesperson, and I feel that responsibility more than ever now, for Chinatown and for the cuisine, and I think our neighborhood has gone through a lot of generations, and I loved our episode because it went through a lot of layers of generations that have experienced it in one way. And for me, growing up, the neighborhood almost was this nostalgic place, but became almost like a museum of sorts. It was more of a tourist destination than a place that a lot of locals continue to come back to. And I think having those layers kind of play out to where we are now, present day, I think it's kind of a really interesting story how all of these, I would say, just the way that you've experienced the neighborhood and the success of maybe one part of this immigrant community that has had to persevere a lot. And this is like it almost feels like this is our turn to kind of step up and stand up for our rights and for each other.
Yeah.
So
definitely. I mean, Brandon, you didn't know this, but when we were at the farm cooking, I kept running into my car also to cool off because it was a very hot day, but I was working on the op-ed that would appear later that week in the Washington Post, because while, the president wasn't tweeting about Chinese, he was tweeting about immigrants, and he tweeted something saying, if you don't like it, why don't you go home? And that really spoke to my 5-year-old self, because I've heard that from different people in my life. I heard it at school. I heard it on the subway. I've heard it just one too many times. And it just goes straight to your heart, because you feel like saying, you know what, fuck you, I am home. I'm home. And so while we were filming and while you were getting all your, dishes and instruments ready to do that beautiful day of cooking that we had out there, I was writing this op-ed literally on my phone and going back and forth with the Washington Post and the ACLU and everything just to get my facts right, because obviously I was also doing our show.
Yeah, such important messages. And Naz, what have been your reflections at this moment in time when racial equity is on the agenda like never before, long overdue societal awakening, and you think about your culture and the role in America? How are things feeling for you?
I don't know if you remember, Padma, but when we were shooting, the day that we shot was, I believe, the first murmurs of a possible, he was throwing around, you know, ideas of a possible, of a possible war, or, you know, as he likes to do, he likes to tease these things out. So that day was particularly poignant because here we were talking about food and, you know, cooking and the culture, and it was in the back of my mind, it was in the back of Padma's mind.
Definitely,
And,
white noise.
yes, it was. So, and then with the events of January 2020 with Iran, 2020 has just kind of really sucked.
I know. In fact, in that episode, in the Iranian episode, when you see me driving in traffic and you hear the radio, the guy in the radio talking about tensions with Iran, that was actually happening. You know, that wasn't something that we found in archive. That was actually happening that week, and it was really, really tense. It felt surreal, you know. And I think for all of us, I mean, this is why I think that Persian food hasn't had the glorious moment and attention in this country that it deserves, because of the tensions between the two countries. And what people fail to realize is that the Iranians that are here in this country are here because they also don't agree with the fundamentalist regime, but yet they're made to pay the price of those sins committed, you know, perceived sins committed by those people. And then they also get lumped in with Arabs because of, you know, us painting the Middle East with just one big brush. I mean, sure, they may, you know, share some of the names because of their religion, but, you know, Arabs are totally different from Persians, and they're just different civilizations, different cultures. And so Iranians, in my opinion, have had in this country, have had a real PR problem that is totally not their fault. But if you would just taste the food, I mean, I think it's like the more elegant, sophisticated, less spicy version of Indian food, because it, you know, it's so delicate and so lovely, and it requires such a subtle hand. I'm waiting for Iranian food to have its big moment because there's no Tehran market in New York City. I've tried to find it.
So I think we're on our way. Obviously, in the before times, pre-COVID, there are these amazing new young chefs across the country who are starting to pop up. In Berkeley, there's Hanif Sadr, who does the pop-ups Comage. In Brooklyn, you have Sofre, so many, but sadly, and Brandon can speak to this too, everything's kind of come to a halt right now, which is another tragedy of this time. But Iranian food, hopefully, is on its way. What I've been wanting to do with my work is to, because I'm a home cook and I'm a writer, but I would like to make Iranian food just another dish that you would think of making on a Wednesday night on a whim, without having to think, oh, I have to make this exotic dish and have all my friends over. And no, it's something that you're just going to throw together, you know, one of the simpler dishes on a Wednesday night, and then have your friends over for Sunday supper and do the big flip and have, you know, a glass of wine. But I think there's no reason why Iranian food can't be that, just like a bolognese or, you know, any other dish that we've gotten accustomed to. We're there. We're so beyond there. We don't even need to, I'd like us to stop having these discussions. That'll be a day to celebrate.
Okay, well, we look forward to that day. And Naz, you were talking about things being put on hold. I mean, obviously, representing the independent restaurant industry, it's been devastating to see the impact that COVID has had on our industry and the communities, especially with the mandated shutdowns. And so, Brandon, please do share with us your experience in terms of your restaurants. I know that you have, like many others, pivoted in terms of a kind of relief kitchen and retail and a whole new line of meal kits. Please share with us what does that entail from a kind of business perspective?
It's a lot of R&D and trial and error. because nothing's really working. So you have to have your hand in a couple of different avenues to see what is going to work now, because it hasn't worked. So when we started, we had we were cooking for World Central Kitchen, and that was good because it was consistent, and it was really, I think, great to be part of that philanthropy. But as we started to understand that this was going to be a longer period of time, because I think initially I didn't think it was going to be this long, and I wasn't planning on it being this long. So every step of the way, it's been trying to make these decisions on the fly. When you're responsible for all your employees, and also like trying to make some of these business decisions, we've just kind of been throwing our hat in a bunch of places. So yeah, like we started this like pop-up that we do with another restaurant, Lord Stanley. We call it Lord Jews. It's just kind of fun. But we have that going. We have some of our hot food program going on top now. We had meal kits going for a while, and we had groceries. But I mean, when I say that ebb and flow is kind of week to week, everyone got really excited about cooking at home and doing all these recipes, and now it's not really the case. Everyone wants hot food, and they're ready for service and ready for dining. And you know, I would love to have people at the restaurant, but my other side of my responsibility is also to take care of my employees, and there's still this massive health concern.
Yeah.
And so business side of me like is thinking, let's try to plan this awesome party and see each other. And then the other side is like, no, we can't see anyone, and we have to limit really our capacity to actually operate food service. So we're really stuck in the middle still.
So
and as long as it's going on, it becomes harder. And there's there's attrition to this. A lot of operators are just every week there's another set of restaurants that have decided to throw in the towel. And that's why the work of the IRC, the work of these other smaller coalitions that are happening, they're really important. And I think the general public doesn't really understand how fragile this industry is, and continues to be susceptible right now.
I think the COVID crisis has just thrown into such sharp relief the fragility of the system, the vulnerability of both the economic model, but also the vulnerability of the workforce, these essential workers, but in terms of healthcare provision and paid leave, etc. I think all of that has been exposed, and certainly part of Open for Good that Padma has been so supportive of is how do we take this opportunity to really reset the industry, and how can we use this as an opportunity to build back better and look at some of the fundamental levers that have led to that fragility.
Sorry, I don't think people realize the margins associated with restaurants. And, you know, I'm not talking about just the mom and pop restaurants. I'm also talking about really big, nationally known by name chefs who've also been struggling and had to shut down several of their restaurants. I can think of 5, just on one hand. And when, we started the emergency relief fund at James Beard, like we had to shut down the application process because just in the short time that it was open, the need was so great. And we had a couple of corporate sponsors, and whoever gave what they could, but it evaporated that money, and it was so heartbreaking. Like in order to fulfill all of the applications needs that, all the applications and all the restaurants who did apply for these grants, they were first come, first served for small restaurants, we would have had to have over $50 million. I don't think, and still that would have been a drop in the bucket. The restaurant industry is the second largest private employer in this country. you know, other than the federal government and the military. And that, you know, that's why we're trying to convince people to have a big package for the restaurant industry, because if you pump money into the restaurant industry, it will get pumped right back into the greater economy. You know, if you give them $100, $90 will go out to farmers and people who make napkins, and I mean, on and on and on and on. Fishermen, the list goes on. It just trickles down to everybody. But somehow, I think we've got this opinion that, you know, restaurateurs aren't in need as much as other people, but because they wear a white coat or something. But they are very much suffering and very much in need.
Indeed, and I think the support, as you said, we're doing a lot of lobbying to secure the level of federal stimulus and federal relief needed. But in terms of this audience here today, what they can do to support your local restaurants to help them open, I think it's a number of things. I mean, one, it's the ones that are open, please buy the meal kits, the takeout, please patronize them. Also, from the relaxation of liquor licenses is actually helpful at the moment in terms of those sales and actually injecting money. Buying gift certificates and supporting when they open up. And I think that support is twofold. One, it's how, to your point, Brandon, the protection of staff. How do consumers, once they have the confidence to go back to dining in, how to ensure that they are kind of good citizens and that they're complying to the safety rules as much as the staff. But equally, when we think about the price of food, actually being prepared to pay higher to ensure that these restaurants that are so critically important, both economically, socially, and culturally, as we've seen, can actually be viable. And for that to be the case, it's going to be multi-dimensional, but some of that has to be, I think, people paying more for the food on their plate.
And to that, sorry, I just wanted to add, and I think this was in Brandon's episode, that something that came up, this idea that has been a part of our culture here in that quote unquote ethnic food, we shouldn't be paying as much for ethnic food. It's cheaper food. I don't really know where that came from or why that is, and to dismantle that. That's not the case. Why do we think of it came up in Brandon's episode, Chinese food has to be cheap, or why does Iranian food, why do we just want like a couple of kebabs for $5 or something, and yet we're willing to go and sit and pay so much more for
a filet mignon, which has just been thrown on the grill,
which is a bad kebab.
TM. And that's why shows like this and education in terms of the cultural contributions and the story behind the food is so important. And I'm conscious of time, so we'll start to wrap up. But one of the observations, Padma, that you make in the show that I thought was so interesting was saying how the American food world is characterized by this push and pull, I think you called it, between assimilation of cultures, wanting to be sort of under the radar, versus being proudly protective and celebrating the distinct culinary cultures, and seeing the tension between the two. I'd love to hear from this panel, just by way of closure, in terms of, do you think that's going to be a dynamic that is sustained indefinitely, given all the factors we talked about in terms of the geopolitics around the world? Or do you think in a world where we hope that enlightenment and acceptance is built, that we will move to more where these individual culinary cultures can really flourish and be celebrated in their own right?
Brandon?
Okay, I'll go. I think when we talk about chop suey, part of that, I think, thesis was that when you eat a certain dish and you start to gain, I'd say, an appreciation for it. And I think with chop suey, it was literally a dish that was created to try to assimilate taste of of Chinese cuisine to American palates. And by doing that, I think there's, that helped to open up doors to other conversations or other dishes. And I think there's something that in Padma's show that's very thematic, is that when you start to learn about these dishes and how they were created and who created them, and you actually love these dishes, then you should be educated enough to really praise these people and these places that these dishes come from. And I think hopefully by doing that, there's, I think, some value that is gained, both on a way of like willingness to pay for it, and also just like a consideration that these cuisines are all great, they're all evolving, and we are all part of that evolution. We have to appreciate each other's food to say that we deserve praise for our food too. So that's the push and pull too.
Thank you. Naz.
I agree. I will be hopeful that we're on a path of evolving and evolution. We'll see. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. These times have been very challenging in that they've really, I feel like we have been pushed to really question and look within, like Brandon said, ourselves as well, within our communities, and the challenges that we face in our own bubbles and communities, and to push against that a little bit, not a little bit, a lot.
Yeah. And Padma,
I think that the place of revelation is that middle space, is this uncomfortable space between being really proud of who you are and really wanting to just disappear into the greater, culture, the monoculture, whatever that means. I think it's also, the reason that ethnic foods are cheaper is because the people who open them up don't have resources to open up really high-end restaurants. And their clientele is often their own community, and that clientele doesn't have the resources to spend a lot of money when they go out to eat. So it's a function of that ethnic foods often wind up being lower priced and, sold in that way, almost per weight, by weight at times. But I do think that what's hopeful to me is the incredible resiliency of people, of their heart, of their wanting to succeed and not just survive, but thrive with their families. And that is a common denominator of most immigrants who are in this country. You don't leave your country, your community, everything you know to come and live across the world if you don't have a good reason to do so. And so that motivation that immigrants have, I think, gives me hope that these cultures will survive, they will thrive, they will find their own space in the larger American pantheon of food, because no mother puts her child in a boat unless the ground she's standing on is less safe.
Very well said. So I think on that that note of hopefulness, and also too, I would enjoin this audience to please watch this show. It's a very important show, and the stories are so powerful. So it's all available on Hulu. Taste the Nation. It's a treat, but it is so multi-dimensioned. But I'd just like to thank you, Padma, Naz, and Brandon. Thank you so much for joining us this evening on behalf of the James Beard Foundation. I wish you all incredibly well, and I look forward to our paths crossing again when the world is maybe a bit more stable, I trust. Okay, thank you all
so much, Claire, and thank you both for joining me for this. It's nice to see you finally on a screen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Bye. Be well, everyone.
Yeah.